Hola, scholars. Today we are looking at Chapter 6, Theory Meets Identity, on page 153 of Queer Theory Now. And this is a really great chapter to focus on because it talks a lot about identity politics, neoliberalism, strategic essentialism, homonormativity, homonationalism. There's a whole bunch of key terms on page 153, and this is a really good chapter if you're interested in transgender studies as well, because there's a little short section at the end of this chapter. And so I think let's start off on page 153, and I'll move us through the chapter with some ideas that you can focus on. So when we think about identity, it's how we explain who we are to someone else. And this chapter in particular is interested in how queer identity overlaps and intersects and has a relationship with notions of queer theory. And so I guess, one thing to remember as we are going into this chapter is that the very notion of the word queer is radically open, and it's not easily defined to, yes, this is queer, and no, that can't be queer. So keep that in mind as we're going through this chapter. And identity politics is a really great key term box on page 154 that talks about our identities and how they overlap with the political work that we might do. And I think that I'm going to kind of gloss over that so you can read it on your own. But I would like to stress right underneath that key term box is this notion of remembering that from last week's chapter on the AIDS crisis, it highlighted the need to focus less on the sexual identity and more on sexual practices. So in this chapter, we're moving back to the notion of identity, and identity as being understood as something that is very fluid and dynamic, and it's not easily pinned down or defined. And so on page 155, we have another key term, which is neoliberalism. And the definition for that, it's best defined as a political ideology that took hold in the 1980s and that has economic and social dimensions to it. Economically, neoliberalism refers to a free market and free trade ideology. It's very much pro-private companies, pro-corporate, pro-business, pro-capitalism. It advocates for less involvement of the government in business. And socially, neoliberalism is associated with individualism, and it's often depoliticized advocacy and support for ideals of privacy and individual liberty. So it's this idea of the personal being private and that the government shouldn't be intervening in that, which is interesting because if you remember in the feminist chapter, I believe that was chapter 3 with sexuality and feminism, they talked a lot about how the personal is political. So this is moving away from that ideology. So I think neoliberalism is important to understand in terms of how it might relate to one's identity. So I wanted to give you a little bit more on that. And I think that also in related to the key term on 156, which is strategic essentialism. And that is this notion that our identities are essentially created. and they're non-moving, or there's a universal ideology involved in our identities. And that's anytime you hear someone talk about essentialism, it's usually a bad thing. However, in this regard, with the key term especially, strategic essentialism is this notion of defining something in such a way that it strategically helps a group of people be identified and be in the center. And so, um, one scholar in particular, Spivak, uh, talked about how it was necessary for political ends to use a type of strategic essentialism in India regarding the subaltern or marginalized demographic in her country. And so sometimes that might be important to consider, because if something is so broad and undefinable, can make it really difficult for others in society to understand that identity or that social identity. And so they're less able to support it or move forward in such a way to garner good improvements in society. And so she kind of argues that sometimes we do need this universal notion of what someone is or is not in order to progress forward in society on terms and positionalities. So the chapter continues with notions of homonormativity and what kind of is a political, it's a politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them while promising the possibility of a demobilized gay constituency and privatized, depoliticized gay culture anchored in domesticity and consumption. So that's on page 157, that definition. It's way at the bottom. So this notion is very much aimed at you could almost say it's similar to the homophile movement that we discussed earlier on. So LGBTQ or gay individuals are just like heterosexuals, and there's like a normal gay, or I don't know if you want to describe it as kind of like a soft or emerging notion of gayness in order to advocate for full inclusion and equality. And so that's talked about a little bit underneath that new homonormativity section. Um, and it's continued on 158. So in other words, homonormative politics aims to protect the private sphere and the private rights of the LGBTIQ individuals, and it aims for equality in the private sphere rather than in the public sphere. They're concerned with individual domestic liberty, such as marriage equality, rather than collective public issues of the gay liberation past, such as around housing, employment, and education. So I think that really gives you a very well defined praxis for, or spectrum for, where they're falling and what they're advocating for. Okay, and so if you move on to page 160, you will come to the section in which it talks about marriage equality, often referred to as same-sex marriage or gay marriage, and family formations, and marriage equality in general. So that's on 160 and 161. 1. And then the book goes on to talk about homonormativity kind of progressing excuse me, to homo nationalism, and that's on 161. So remember, nationalism is often assigned with our citizenship and where we live in a country. And so you can see you have a lot of American nationalists or nationalist pride. And in this sense, they're talking about homo nationalism, which is designed to address this question of the normative sexual citizen. So, and it goes on to page 162, and there's a really good definition underneath the key concept of the sexual citizenship box. It says homo nationalism refers to how LGBTIQ rights are utilized and promoted by some nation states for the purpose of evidencing progress and exceptionalism to assist in maintaining border regimes against certain outside populations. So, homo nationalism actually ends up being used in such a way to promote non-change almost, but make it seem like change is happening. And there's some really important connections made at the bottom of that 162 between homo nationalism and xenophobia and homosexuality and U.S. nationalism producing a sort of violence. So I would have you read that a little more closely. We have some discussion about the wounded attachment theory that is promoted by Wendy Brown, as it's at the bottom of 163. As a new homonormative identity politics emerged in the 1990s, so too did theorists turn to critiques around this new emphasis on individual identity-based politics. Of particular note is Wendy Brown's work on what she calls wounded attachments. She argues that a kind of difference-based politics had arisen, those positioned as marginal, paradoxically adapted categorizations of otherness, such as queer, in a political move that repeats the rhetorics of difference. And so, in terms of this notion of otherness, that it contributed to the formation of that excluded and injured sense of self, which sits in contrast to a fantasy notion of a social ideal. So, for instance, she writes, without recourse to the white masculine middle class ideal, politicized identities would forfeit a good deal of their claims to injury and exclusion and their claims to the political significance of their difference. So what is she saying there? What does that mean? In other words, identities require a continual ideal reference point to maintain relative identification. So we wouldn't know what we were missing, so to speak, if we didn't hold up one categorization as this is what everyone in society is aiming for. Everyone wants this kind of middle class ideal family home with excuse me, 2.5 kids and a dog and a white picket fence, and that is part of the problems in terms of the other, the self that doesn't have that is always wanting. So this is kind of an interesting section of the chapter, and it's paired with the queer theory and practice box on 165, which is trigger warnings. And then we get into perhaps my favorite part, and I know I'm going a little long on this lecture, so I'm going to try to wrap it up, and we'll have a great assignment related to this chapter later, is transgender identity, and that starts on page 166, and we go through transgender identity and cisgender and the rise of transgender studies. You learn about STAR, which is on page 169, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. Now, that is from the 1970s with Sylvia Rivera and Martha P. Johnson. So, and that's kind of a really neat little key focus box for those of you that are very interested in these transgender revolutionaries. And then there's some great references to films like Serrano's or books such as The Whipping Girl on page 170. And before we move on from this chapter, let me just read one quote here. That at the bottom of 166, if you see the term trans with an asterisk, it represents an infinity number of possible gender embodiments. This terminology stands at odds with the history of gender variance, which has been collapsed into concise definitions, sure medical pronouncements, and fierce exclusions. Another definition of transgender, further up on page 166, is came to be commonly used as an umbrella term for a range of gender diverse identity. And then on page 167, you have genderphobia or transphobia. And then they mention that we should acknowledge that trans persons may also be gay or lesbian, and that there may be some overlap within communities, but that it can also contribute to the types of oppression and gender and sexuality any group might experience. And then I was also going to identify trans subjectivity on page 168. It's in the middle of the paragraph. So there's a really good quote from Stryker. People with trans identities could describe themselves as men and women too, or they resist binary categorization altogether. But in doing either, they queer the dominant relationship of sex, body, and gendered subject. And then right underneath that, here Stryker alludes to the fact that trans subjectivity is a challenge to traditional binary counts of gender, and this point sits in contrast to the transphobic accusations of the radical feminists since the 1970s. And so, indeed, it's this notion that you can be born or assigned a certain sex at birth, but it doesn't represent who you are. And so then a trans individual aligns who they are on the inside with what it's reflected on the outside. And of course, there is no one unique way on how to do it, whether someone uses medical interventions or hormones or someone doesn't within that transgender community. It's very variant, it's very diverse, just like most of, all of our queer communities. So keeping that in mind as well. And then the rise of transgender studies, and I talking about this community within academia and within social and political and psychological spaces. It's really a very new field of study. The 1990s, Judith Butler, they have done a lot of work on some of this as well as Stryker. And it's important to note that transgender studies specifically places the experiences of our trans community and the trans identity at the center. And so, for instance, like if we're thinking of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson being involved in a lot of the work with pride parades and resistance right after the Stonewall riots, their focus on themselves as transgender individuals was often put in the outskirts of the focus of the entire movement. Like, we're not ready to put that in the center and work on your issues, so let's work on this one first, like gay marriage or something. So transgender studies gives a space for that, for those concerns and topics and issues to always be centered and talked about first. Okay, let's see. Okay, so what I was talking about earlier too with surgery versus non-surgery, there's a really good discussion of that on page 171 at the very bottom. Indeed, a quote, wrong body discourse, the idea that trans identity is simply about being born into an incorrect body, which it is not. It's not, it can't be reduced to that. It's so diverse. And you'll notice that in the ContraPoints video that is part of your assignment for this week. It emerged in the mainstream accounts of trans experiences. Excuse me, and it has been reiterated within medical gatekeeping communities around trans identity. So it talks about moving outside of this very narrow range of understanding a trans experience. And in general, the lived body experience, or phenomenology, which is talked about on page 172. And then finally, transnormativity and its issue of representation, and transitioning that into discussions of non-binary identities, which is discussed on page 174. And the book does a good job of taking the notion of non-binary or genderqueer, in which they describe at the bottom of 174 people's identity, rather than physicality at birth. It does not exclude people who are intersex. Whatever the birth physicality, there are non-binary people who identify as a single fixed gender position other than male or female, and then there are those who are who have a fluid gender, and then there are those who have no gender, and then there are those who disagree with the very idea of gender altogether. So non-binary, it's also a very vast category, and it can be very diverse too. And they take you into a nice discussion about how there are lots of societies around the world that have gender fluid or alternative gender identities. And that's talked about at the top of 175, like the Hedra, the two spirits. And it's very, I wish that they had more details for you, but it's really a good starting point for you to do some additional research on it as well. And then I think it ends with a very nice framework that made me think of Gloria Anzaldúa, and it's a quote from her: "Identity is a river. A process contained within the river is identity, and it needs to flow, to change, to stay a river." So, reach out to me when you have questions on this chapter. It ends on page 178. I know the lecture was a little long, but hopefully you found it really helpful. See you in class. Thanks.